For 40 years, she had stood beside a king who loved her with the unhurried devotion of a man who understood that the greatest thing he would ever rule was not a kingdom, but the life they had built together. For 40 years, she had been Luna. Voice, anchor, the still center around which a court moved. She had survived winters that took stronger people. She had survived the particular permanent wound of a cradle emptied in the night, a son carried away by hands she would not name for 30 years, a grief she learned to fold so small it fit inside an ordinary day without showing. And then, quietly, mercifully in his sleep, the Alpha King Torben was gone, his great hands folded over his chest as if he had simply decided at last to rest. And 3 hours later, before she had changed her shoes, before she had done anything except stand in the corridor outside his chamber and breathe, his brother came to her door with 4 guards and a smile she finally, fully understood. She was 80 years old. She was carrying 7 heirs to the throne. She had just lost the man who had been her home for 4 decades, and she was expelled from her own kingdom in court slippers. She walked north. Not because she had a plan. Because the north was away, and away was the only direction. And she did not know, walking through the dark on roads that smelled of frost and old pine, that she was walking toward the answer to a 30-year question. She did not know that a young woman would find her in a barn and change everything. She knew only the cold, the darkness, the 7 lives pressing warm against her ribs, and the quiet, unshakable certainty, wolf deep, bone deep, older than kingdoms, that she was not done yet. She was right. She had no idea how right she was. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The straw beneath her feet was damp, and the cold had long since stopped bothering her. Elizabeth had walked through worse. She had survived a fever that the healers said might take her. But she proved them wrong, survived 30 years of a hollow ache in her chest where a mother's certainty had once lived. The quiet, unshakable knowing that her firstborn son was somewhere in this world, breathing, growing, perhaps even laughing at things she would never hear. She had survived all of it with her spine straight and her chin level. But tonight, for the first time in a very long while, Elizabeth was not sure her legs would carry her much further. She lowered herself onto a bale of hay near the far wall of the old barn, moving slowly, one hand pressed flat against the curve of her belly. Even through the thick wool of her traveling cloak, the plain one, grabbed in the dark because it was the nearest thing to hand, she could feel them. All 7, warm and restless, and entirely unaware of the chaos their existence had caused. One of the litter shifted against her ribs, and she exhaled through her nose, long and careful. Torben, she thought, with a mix of wonder and exhaustion. 7 little ones, all ours. The thought of him cracked something open behind her sternum. She pressed her lips together and looked up at the ceiling. Dark timber, cobwebs, a pale sliver of moonlight easing through a gap in the boards. And she did not cry. She had wept in the corridor outside Torben's chamber when the healers told her he had passed gently in his sleep, surrounded by peace, his great silver-streaked hands folded over his chest as if he had simply decided to rest. She had cried on the road out of the eastern gate, walking alone in the gray hour before dawn with a bundle on her back and a kingdom's worth of silence behind her. She had used up her tears honestly and completely, and now there was nothing left but the cold, the straw, and the slow, rhythmic turning of 7 small lives that did not yet know their father was gone. Their kind, the wolf-blooded, the shifters of the old bloodlines, were not born walking upright. Wolf cubs came into the world as nature intended, small and furred, tumbling over each other in the warmth of the den, learning everything worth knowing through scent, long before they ever learned it through words. It was only at the ceremony of the first moon, held when a pup reached their 3rd year, beneath an open sky, with the elders singing the old invitation into the dark, that the shift was formally awakened. From that night forward, both forms belonged to them. The wolf was not replaced by the human shape. It was simply joined by something new, a voice, a pair of hands, the ability to sit at a table or sign a treaty or, in Torben's case, rule a kingdom for 57 years with a steadiness that made other kings uneasy. Elizabeth had always loved both her forms with equal devotion. As a young woman, she had run the northern forests in her wolf shape until her paws knew every root and river bend by heart. As Luna, she had stood beside Torben in the great hall and spoken with a calm authority that made grown alphas reconsider their positions mid-sentence. She had been both, always, the wolf and the woman, the mate and the queen. And for one brief, blazing year, she had also been a mother. Her firstborn had been a boy, a strong pup, darker furred than most, with a small white crescent mark just behind his left ear. The birthmark that ran through Torben's bloodline like a signature written into the bone itself. She had called him Caius before he even had his ceremony, which was technically against tradition, and Torben had pretended to disapprove while obviously loving the name immediately. They had been happy. For exactly 1 year and some months, they had been extraordinarily, embarrassingly happy. And then Caius was gone. No warning, no body, no explanation that satisfied. Only an empty cradle and a nursemaid who had been tricked into falling asleep. She woke unharmed hours later, remembering nothing, and the particular silence of an empty cradle that Elizabeth had never quite stopped hearing, somewhere in the back of her mind, for 30 long years. She closed her eyes now and breathed in the barn. Hay. Old timber. Somewhere outside, a nightbird. And beneath all of it, faint but present, the cool green smell of the northern hills, wilder than home, less cultivated, carrying in its edges the faint mineral sharpness of distant streams. She had made it further than she'd expected, given the state of her feet. The state of her feet was, frankly, an embarrassment. She had been expelled from her own kingdom in court slippers. This was the detail that kept surfacing with an almost absurd indignity. Not boots, slippers. Because Edron had come for her 3 hours after Torben's body was still warm, and she had not yet had the presence of mind to change her shoes. Edron, Torben's younger brother, the man who had stood at their mating ceremony 40 years ago with a smile so warm she had genuinely believed for years that he loved his brother. She understood now that what Edron had loved was proximity to power, and that the two things had simply occupied the same space for a very long time. He had come to her chamber with 4 of the border guards, her border guards, wearing the kingdom's colors. And he had looked at her belly with an expression she would spend a long time trying to name. Not hatred exactly, something colder, calculation wearing the mask of disgust. "You will leave," he had said, quietly enough that the guards couldn't hear. "You will go north, and you will be kept away from the court. Do this, and everyone stays safe. Refuse—" He had paused, tilting his head, and smiled the way a man smiles when he is absolutely certain of his position. "Well, you know what happened last time, don't you, Elizabeth?" The room had gone very still. She had not moved, had not flinched, had not wept, had not reached for the ceremonial blade on Torben's desk, though she absolutely could have reached it. She had simply looked at Edron, this man she had known for 40 years, this man who had sat at her table and eaten her food and stood at her husband's shoulder at every major ceremony of their lives together. And then, with the particular clarity that arrives only when every other option has been stripped away, she understood. Caius. Edron. It had been Edron. All of it. A silence opened inside her. Not the silence of grief, but the silence of something finally, terribly named. 30 years of not knowing collapsed into one cold second of knowing too much. She had walked out of the castle in her court slippers, and she had not looked back, because if she had looked back, she might have done something that would have put everything at risk. Her pups, their future, the very breath they had not yet drawn. And that was the one thing, the singular, absolute thing. She was not willing to gamble. So, here she was, a barn in the north, 80 years old, both feet blistered, carrying 7 heirs to a throne that a coward was currently warming with borrowed authority, sitting on hay that smelled of old seasons and rain. One of the 7 pressed against her ribs from the inside, slow, deliberate, almost like a nudge. I know, she thought. I know, we are not done yet. She pulled her cloak tighter and let herself rest. Just rest, not sleep, just the small mercy of closed eyes and still legs. While outside, the northern night deepened around her, vast and quiet, and entirely indifferent to the extraordinary thing it was sheltering in its oldest barn. She did not hear the farmhouse door across the yard open, warm light spilling briefly into the dark before it shut again. She did not hear the soft footsteps crossing the frost-hard ground, quick and purposeful. She did not hear any of it, until the barn door swung open with a sound like a question, and a young woman's voice, bright with alarm and absolutely zero hesitation, filled the space from wall to wall. "Oh my goodness! Oh no, no, no! You are not having those pups in my barn without a warm blanket and a cup of something hot. Up you get, grandmother. Up. I have opinions about this, and I intend to share all of them." Elizabeth opened her eyes. The young woman in the doorway was perhaps 26, holding a lantern in one hand and what appeared to be a wooden spoon in the other, wearing an apron dusted generously with flour and an expression of such immediate, bossy compassion that something in Elizabeth's chest, the part that had been clenched tight since the corridor outside Torben's chamber, loosened, just slightly, for the first time in days. The air that followed her in smelled of wood smoke and baked bread and something faintly herbal. Rosemary, perhaps, warm and domestic and so unexpectedly kind that Elizabeth had to look away for a moment. "I'm fine," she said. "You are absolutely not fine," the young woman said, already moving toward her, lantern swinging. "You are in my barn, in slippers, in the middle of the night, and you look like you've walked from the Eastern Territories on sheer stubbornness alone. My name is Brenna. Come inside before I have a complete crisis about this. I've already nearly burned the bread twice tonight, and I truly cannot handle anything else going wrong." She extended her free hand, flour on the knuckles, a small callus at the base of the thumb from someone who worked hard and worked often, and waited with the easy patience of someone accustomed to being taken at her word. "My husband is inside," Brenna added, almost as an afterthought. "He's very strong, absolutely useless in emergencies, but he can carry things. He also has a habit of going very quiet when something surprises him and then staring at it for too long, which I find both endearing and incredibly inconvenient. You'll see." Elizabeth accepted the offered hand and rose, slowly, with the careful dignity of someone who had never fully stopped being a queen, even standing in a stranger's barn in ruined shoes. "Elizabeth," she said quietly. "My name is Elizabeth." Brenna beamed at her, wooden spoon still raised like a small, absurd scepter. "Lovely name. Can you walk, or shall I call him?" "I can walk," Elizabeth said. And she did, one step, then another, her hand still in Brenna's warm, flour-dusted grip, moving toward the light of the farmhouse across the frost-dark yard. Behind her, the barn settled back into its quiet. Ahead, a door waited, and behind it, the smell of wood smoke grew stronger, and somewhere inside, a fire burned, and a man who stared too long at surprising things was about to look up from whatever he was doing. Elizabeth did not yet know why the back of her throat tightened as they crossed the threshold. She would. The farmhouse was small, and Brenna had strong opinions about everything inside it. This became clear within approximately 40 seconds of crossing the threshold. "Sit there." "No, not that chair. That one wobbles. Finn keeps saying he'll fix it and keeps absolutely not fixing it. Sit here. This one is solid. I tested it myself. Are you cold? You look cold. I'm going to make you tea. Actually, I'm going to make you soup. Do you have a preference? It doesn't matter. I'm making soup regardless. I just like to ask. Elizabeth sat in the indicated chair, solid as promised, and folded her hands over her belly and watched Brenna move through her kitchen the way a river moves through a familiar valley, quickly, confidently, and with occasional unexpected turns. The wooden spoon had been set down somewhere and replaced by a ladle. A pot appeared on the fire with a speed that suggested it had been waiting there all along, which it probably had. The kitchen smelled extraordinary. Bread cooling on a rack near the window, slightly darker on one side, evidence of the twice-near burning Brenna had mentioned, dried herbs hanging in small bundles from the low ceiling, thyme and rosemary, and something else Elizabeth couldn't immediately name. A fire that had been burning long enough to have opinions of its own. The kind of warmth that didn't just heat the skin but reached further, into the places that had been cold for days. Elizabeth breathed it in and said nothing, because for the moment, saying nothing was the most she could manage. "Finn!" Brenna called, not turning from the fire. "We have a guest. Come and be useful." A pause from somewhere deeper in the house. Then a voice, low, a little careful, the voice of a man choosing his words before he released them. "You said that about the dog last month. The dog was not a guest situation." "This is different from the dog situation," Brenna said. "Entirely different. Come and see." Another pause, then footsteps, unhurried but present, and the interior door opened and a man stepped into the kitchen and stopped. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work with their hands, wearing the kind of tired that came from a long day honestly finished. His eyes, dark, steady, slightly too still for a face so young, moved from Brenna to Elizabeth, and there they stayed. Brenna had been entirely correct. He stared for too long. Elizabeth looked back at him with the patient calm she had spent decades perfecting, and something happened in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Something that was not quite recognition, because she had never seen this man before in her life. Something older than recognition. Something that lived below thought, in the part of her that was still, always, a wolf. "This is Elizabeth," Brenna said cheerfully, ladling broth with the focused energy of someone completing a mission. "She was in our barn, in slippers. Don't make it strange." "I'm not making it strange," Finn said, still looking at Elizabeth. "You're doing the staring thing." "I'm not—" He stopped, appeared to consider. "I'll get more wood for the fire," he said, and went back through the door he had come from. Brenna watched him go with the fond, mildly exasperated expression of a woman who had catalogued her husband's peculiarities and chosen to love them anyway. "He's not unfriendly," she said, setting a bowl of soup in front of Elizabeth with the quiet authority of someone who would not accept refusal. "He's just—" Finn takes a moment. "He always has. I've known him since we were young, and he has always needed approximately 3 times longer than everyone else to adjust to new information. It used to drive me mad. Now I find it rather endearing. Most of the time." "Most of the time," Elizabeth repeated. "There was an incident with a market in late autumn," Brenna said gravely. "I'll tell you about it when you've finished your soup." Elizabeth looked down at the bowl. Thick broth, root vegetables, something dark and fragrant floating at the edges. Wild herbs, foraged rather than cultivated, the kind of thing someone learned from a grandmother or from the land itself. She lifted the spoon. It was, without question, the best thing she had tasted in weeks. She did not say this aloud, because she had the ingrained dignity of a woman who had hosted state dinners for 40 years and knew better than to appear easily impressed. But something in her expression must have shifted, because Brenna, without turning from the fire, said, "I know," with a satisfaction that required no modesty whatsoever. The soup was half finished when the pups made their opinions about the evening known. It started as it always did, a slow, rolling pressure, one after another like a wave moving through deep water, and then the particular sensation of several small someones deciding simultaneously that the current arrangement of space was insufficient for their needs. Elizabeth set down her spoon with great composure and pressed one hand flat against her side and breathed. Brenna turned around. Her eyes went to Elizabeth's belly, to the visible, unmistakable movement rippling slowly beneath the wool of her cloak, and her expression moved through several stages in rapid succession: surprise, delight, concern, and then a very specific variety of practical alarm. "Oh," she said. "They're fine," Elizabeth said. "They do this." "How many?" "7. The ladle Brenna was holding executed a small, involuntary movement. "7, she repeated. 7. Brenna set the ladle down with great deliberateness. She pulled out the chair across from Elizabeth and sat in it. She looked at Elizabeth's belly for a moment with the focused expression of someone doing internal arithmetic. Then she looked at Elizabeth's face. "Right," she said. "You are staying here until they arrive. I'm not negotiating this." "You don't know anything about me," Elizabeth said, with the mild tone of someone pointing out a fact rather than objecting to a conclusion. "I know you were in my barn in slippers at midnight carrying 7 pups, and you've been too dignified to complain once since you walked through my door," Brenna said. "That's enough. Finn." The interior door opened with a speed that suggested he had been closer than the wood supply would explain. He appeared in the doorway with an armful of logs and the look of a man who had been listening carefully to a conversation he was pretending not to hear. "She's staying," Brenna said. Finn looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at Finn. That stillness moved through his face again. Not confusion, not discomfort, but something quieter and more specific, like a question he didn't yet have words for. "Of course," he said. Simply, without hesitation, in the tone of someone for whom this was not actually a difficult decision at all. He set the logs by the fire and crouched to arrange them, and the firelight caught the left side of his face, and the back of his neck, and the small pale mark just behind his left ear, crescent-shaped, faint against the skin, the kind of mark most people would never notice. Elizabeth noticed. The spoon slipped from her fingers and rang against the bowl, and Brenna was already saying, "Careful, careful," and reaching across to steady it, and the fire popped, and the herbs swayed overhead, and the soup steamed gently between them, and Finn looked up at the small sound, straight at her, steady and dark-eyed, and waited. The kitchen was very warm. Elizabeth's heart was doing something it had not done in 30 years. "Finn," she said, and her own voice came out differently than she intended, softer and cracked at the edges, the way old wood cracks when something true presses too hard against it. Is that a family name?" He tilted his head, that small, careful gesture of someone adjusting to new information at their own pace. "My given name," he said. "I don't have a family name. I was raised in the village near the Eastern Castle. Orphan." He said the last word the way people say things they have long since made peace with. Matter of fact. No performance of pain. "Never knew my parents. They tell me I arrived as a pup. Very young. Smaller than usual. A little dark-furred. The woman who found me called me Finn because she said I looked like I was still trying to figure out where I was going." Brenna smiled. "She wasn't wrong," she said fondly, and reached over and touched his arm briefly, the easy touch of a woman entirely certain of her welcome. Finn's mouth curved, quiet, private, the smile of someone who had found his where he was going eventually and knew it. And Elizabeth sat very still, with her hands flat on the table and the crescent mark burning in the corner of her vision, and 30 years pressing against the back of her sternum like a tide that had been waiting for exactly this moment to finally come in. She did not say anything. Not yet. There were things that could not be said over a bowl of soup, in a warm kitchen, on the first night. There were things that needed to be said in daylight, with room to breathe, with time for the ground to hold steady afterward. But in the deepest, oldest part of her, in the wolf that had never stopped knowing, something lifted its head and went very, very still. "Found you," it whispered, in a voice like the first green thing after winter. "Found you." Later, when Brenna had made up the small back room with more blankets than any single person could reasonably require, I'll add one more, the nights here are genuinely unreasonable, and Finn had brought in a pitcher of water and set it on the table beside the bed and looked at her once more with those two steady eyes before saying goodnight. Elizabeth lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the farmhouse settle around her. Outside, the northern wind moved through the grass. Inside, somewhere down the hall, she could hear Brenna and Finn speaking in low voices. Brenna animated, Finn answering in shorter phrases, the familiar rhythm of two people who knew each other thoroughly and had stopped needing volume to be understood. One of the seven shifted, slow and dreamlike, and pressed briefly against her palm. "I know," Elizabeth thought. "I know." She closed her eyes. For the first time in days, sleep came easily. Not because the danger had passed, not because she had forgotten what Edrin had done or what he was still capable of, not because the grief of losing Torben had lessened even slightly, but because something had shifted in the world tonight, some great quiet gear turning in the dark, and she was old enough and wise enough and wolf enough to recognize the feeling. This was not the end of anything. This was, against all probability, a beginning. Morning arrived in the northern hills without apology. Light pushed through the gap in the shutters in a single hard line, landing directly across Elizabeth's face with the blunt efficiency of someone who had a schedule to keep. She was already awake. She had been awake for some time, in fact, lying still in the narrow back room with her hands folded over her belly, listening to the farmhouse breathe around her, doing the things she had always done in the hour before dawn, thinking without moving, the old wolf discipline of stillness before action. She had not slept long, but she had slept deeply, and that was its own kind of miracle. The mark behind Finn's ear had been there every time she closed her eyes, small, pale, crescent-shaped, exactly where it should be on a child of Torben's blood. She had kissed that spot 100 times in one short year, pressed her nose to the soft fur just behind that ear, and breathed in the particular warm scent of her son, the way wolves breathe in everything that matters, deep and deliberate and permanent. She knew what she had seen. The question, the one that had kept the other half of the night occupied, was not whether. It was how. How does a woman say to a 30-year-old man, a man who has built a life and a marriage and a quiet dignity of his own, "I believe I am your mother, and nothing about your existence has been what you were told"? There was no graceful version of that sentence. She was still searching for a less ungraceful one when the kitchen erupted. It began with a crash. Then Brenna's voice, sharp and bright. "That is not! Finn, do not let it—" Then a sound Elizabeth had not heard in 30 years but recognized immediately and completely, the way you recognize the particular quality of silence before a storm. The short, warning bark of a young wolf who was extremely unhappy about something. Elizabeth was out of bed and through the door before she had made a conscious decision to move. The kitchen was in a state of organized catastrophe. The bread rack had been knocked from the windowsill. A clay pot was rolling in a slow, self-important circle near the far wall. Brenna was standing on the second rung of a small wooden step stool, not because she needed the height, Elizabeth would later determine, but because it had been the nearest elevated surface available, and she was holding her wooden spoon aloft with both hands like a woman who intended to use it and had not yet determined on what. In the center of the kitchen floor sat a wolf pup. Enormous for a pup. Dark-furred, silver at the tips, with the particular broad-shouldered build that spoke of a lineage accustomed to ruling things. He was sitting with his haunches on the flagstones and his ears angled in two slightly different directions, which gave him an expression of aggressive uncertainty. In front of him, the remains of what had been a small wheel of cheese, He looked up at Elizabeth when she appeared in the doorway. She looked back at him. "That," said Brenna from the step-stool with impressive composure, "appeared through the back door approximately 4 minutes ago. I don't know whose it is. It ate my cheese. I have questions." Finn was crouched near the far wall, very still, watching the pup with those careful dark eyes. He had not retreated, had not reached for anything. He was simply present in the particular way he had, as though his body understood instinctively how to share space with a creature that hadn't decided yet whether to trust him. The pup's ears swiveled toward Finn. Finn said nothing, did not move. Just met the young wolf's gaze with a patience that was, Elizabeth thought, with the part of her mind still capable of noticing things past the sudden tight thunder of her heartbeat, extraordinary for someone who had supposedly been raised entirely among humans in a village orphanage. "He's not going to hurt anyone," Finn said quietly. "He's scared." "He ate an entire wheel of cheese," Brenna said. "Scared animals don't commit to a project like that." "Scared animals absolutely commit to a project like that," Finn said. "Eating is comfort. He's young and he's lost, and he found something that smelled good." Elizabeth crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and crouched, slowly, carefully, with a small grunt of effort that she was not pleased about, in front of the pup. He was perhaps 8 months old enough to shift, young enough that he sometimes forgot to. His fur smelled of pine and cold water and something else beneath that, something mineral and ancient, the specific scent signature of a bloodline. She had not smelled that particular bloodline in decades. Her hands were steady. She was extremely proud of her hands for being steady. She held one out, palm up, in the old greeting, the wolfkin gesture that predated language, that every shifter child learned before they learned to speak. "I am not a threat. I know what you are. You are known here." The pup stared at her palm for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and pressed his nose to it, hard, the way young wolves greet pack elders. And the kitchen went very still. "Someone is looking for him," Elizabeth said. They were seated around the kitchen table, Brenna with tea, Finn with his hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't drunk from, Elizabeth with her spine straight and her hands flat on the table in the unconscious posture of someone chairing a meeting they did not call. The pup had been fed the remaining scraps of last night's soup and was now asleep in front of the fire with the aggressive bonelessness of the extremely young and recently full. "He came from the east," Elizabeth continued. "His scent is old bloodline, not common. The kind of lineage that traces back to the founding territories." Brenna looked at the sleeping pup, then at Elizabeth, then at Finn, then back at Elizabeth with the expression of a woman doing sums that were adding up to something much larger than she'd budgeted for. "You know a lot about wolf bloodlines," she said carefully. "I do," Elizabeth agreed, and did not elaborate. Another pause. "Elizabeth," Brenna said, in the tone of someone who had been exercising tremendous patience and was approaching its outer limits with great dignity. "I fed you, I gave you my best blankets, I got off the step stool, and I have not asked a single intrusive question since last night, which I want acknowledged because it represents an enormous personal effort. Who are you?" Finn's eyes came up from the table. That long, still look. Waiting. And here it was. The moment Elizabeth had spent the pre-dawn hours trying to find a graceful path around, and here it was regardless, arrived on its own schedule the way important things always did. She looked at Brenna, warm, honest, flour-dusted Brenna, who had walked into a barn with a wooden spoon and no hesitation, and offered everything she had to a stranger. And then she looked at Finn, who was looking back at her with those dark, steady eyes that were, without question, Torben's eyes, wearing a 30-year-old face. "My name," she said carefully, "is Elizabeth of the Eastern Realm. I am, the Luna Queen of the Torben line. My husband, King Torben, died 9 days ago, She paused, letting that settle. I was expelled from my own kingdom by his brother Idrin, who intends to claim the throne. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. Brenna had both hands around her mug and was breathing with great deliberateness. Right, she said. Right. Okay. A pause. And the 7 pups. Are the king's heirs? Elizabeth said, which is precisely why Edrin needed me gone before they arrived. Brenna put her mug down. She picked it up again. She looked at the ceiling briefly, as though requesting assistance from some higher organizational authority. I'm going to need something stronger than tea, she said. But we don't have anything stronger than tea, so we're going to do this on tea, and I'm going to be entirely mature about it. Finn had not moved, had not spoken. He was looking at Elizabeth with an expression she recognized now. The same expression he'd worn last night when he came through the door and stopped. The same quality of stillness, but deeper now, pressed further in, like something pushing against a surface from the wrong side. You said, he began, and stopped. Waited. Started again. You said Edrin took things from you before the pups. The sentence landed in the room with its full weight. Elizabeth held his gaze. Yes, she said. What did he take? The fire was very warm. The pup breathed in slow rhythms near the hearth. Outside, somewhere, a morning bird was beginning its argument with the day, bright and insistent and entirely unaware of what was happening in this small kitchen in the northern hills. Elizabeth reached across the table, slowly, deliberately, the way you move when the next thing you do will change everything. And she set her fingers lightly against the side of Finn's face. He did not pull back. He went very still, the absolute stillness of a creature whose instincts are paying attention even when the mind hasn't caught up yet. She turned his head, gently, just enough. The crescent mark behind his left ear was exactly where it had always been. He arranged for my son to be taken. A baby of 1 year, a dark-furred pup, raised far from home, never knowing who he truly was. A pup with a mark just here, that mark, that every child of Torben's blood has carried since the first Alpha King drew breath. Finn did not move. He was raised as an orphan, Elizabeth continued very quietly. In a village near the eastern castle. I was told... She stopped, steadied, continued. I was told nothing. For 30 years, I was told nothing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence Elizabeth had ever sat inside, full of 30 years, full of every morning she had looked east without knowing why, full of every time Torben had gone quiet at the mention of Caius, and they had held each other's grief between them like something too fragile to put down. Finn's throat moved. Once. Brenna made a small, involuntary sound. Not words, just the sound a person makes when something enormous lands. And her hand found Finn's arm across the table and held it, and she did not say anything, because for the first time since Elizabeth had met her, Brenna understood that silence was what was needed, and she gave it without hesitation. Finn looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at Finn. I don't... he started. You don't have to know yet, she said. You don't have to be anything yet. I'm not asking you for anything. A pause. I needed you to know. I needed someone in this world to know who you are. The pup by the fire twitched in its sleep, chasing something through its dreams, small paws flickering against the warm stones. And Finn, this man who took 3 times longer than everyone else to adjust to new information, who went quiet when surprised and stared too long and had the eyes of a king he had never met. Finn pressed his face briefly into his hands and breathed, and then lifted his head and looked at her again. And this time, something in his face had shifted. Not resolved, not certain, but open. In a way it hadn't been before. My name, he said slowly, testing the shape of something new. Was Caius? It was the name I gave you, Elizabeth said, before your ceremony, which was technically against tradition. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. My father, he said. Would he have... The door blew open, not the wind, not gently. It slammed back on its hinges with a force that rattled the dried herbs overhead and knocked Brenna's mug sideways and brought the pup to its feet by the fire with a snarl that was, for 8 months old, impressively authoritative. Cold air poured in across the flagstones. In the doorway stood 2 men in the deep charcoal gray of Edrin's border guard. Behind them, visible on the frost-hard road, 3 horses. Breath steaming. Swords not yet drawn, but hands not far. The taller of the 2 looked at Elizabeth with the flat, professional expression of someone completing an assignment. The woman called Elizabeth, he said, by order of Regent Edrin of the Eastern Realm. You'll come with us. The pup snarled again, louder. Brenna very slowly picked up her wooden spoon from the table, and Finn stood up, unhurried, complete, every inch of him suddenly occupying the room differently than it had a moment before, and placed himself between the doorway and Elizabeth, with a stillness that was no longer the stillness of a man adjusting to information. It was something older, something that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for exactly this. She's not going anywhere, Finn said, in a voice Elizabeth had not heard from him before. Low, certain. The voice of someone who has just, in the space of a single morning, remembered what he is. The guard's hand moved toward his sword. The pup crouched, and Brenna, wooden spoon raised, said, with magnificent, completely misplaced confidence, I'd really think carefully about what you do next, because I have opinions and a very solid spoon and absolutely nothing to lose before breakfast. There is a particular kind of silence that falls between a threat and its consequence. A held breath, a suspended second where the world waits to see which way the river will run. That silence lived in Brenna's kitchen for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Finn moved, not toward the guards, not away from Elizabeth. He simply expanded somehow, the way a fire expands when you open the flue, filling the available space with a heat and a presence that had not been there a moment before. He stood with his feet planted on the flagstones and his hands loose at his sides, and looked at the 2 men in the doorway, with an expression so completely calm that it was, in its own way, more unnerving than fury would have been. The taller guard's hand was still near his sword. It stayed there, did not complete the motion. You have 2 choices, Finn said, in that low new voice that did not sound entirely like him, and yet sounded more like him than anything Elizabeth had heard from him before. You leave now, and no one in this house has cause to remember your faces. Or you don't leave, and we have a much longer conversation about what exactly you think you're doing on private land, in a kingdom that Edrin does not yet govern, making demands of a woman who has done nothing except survive a very long walk in inadequate footwear. A pause. I'd recommend the first option, he added. I have a strong preference for short conversations before breakfast. The shorter guard looked at the taller one. The taller one looked at Finn. Then, almost involuntarily, his gaze moved to the pup by the fire, who was still crouched, ears flat, producing a sound from somewhere deep in its small chest that was considerably larger than its body suggested was possible. Then his gaze moved to Brenna, who was holding her wooden spoon with both hands and the expression of a woman fully committed to a course of action she had not entirely thought through. Something shifted in the tall guard's calculation. We'll return, he said flatly. I assumed, Finn replied. They left. The door swung shut behind them, and the sound of hooves on frost-hard ground faded north, and the kitchen exhaled. Brenna lowered her spoon, looked at it, looked at Finn. I was going to use this, she said seriously. I know, Finn said. It's a very good spoon. It is an excellent spoon. He turned from the door, and the new quality in him, that deeper, older stillness, was already settling back into the familiar shape of the man she'd married, like water finding its level. But not entirely. Not completely. Something had surfaced this morning that was not going back down. He looked at Elizabeth. She looked back at him, with her hands folded over her belly and her spine straight, and the expression of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that what just happened in this kitchen was only the beginning of something much larger. "They'll come back with more," she said. "Edrin doesn't send 2 men unless he's already decided what to do if 2 men fail. How long do we have?" "A day. Perhaps less." Finn nodded slowly, in the way of someone filing information rather than reacting to it. He pulled out a chair and sat, not across from Elizabeth this time, but beside her, which was a small thing, and not a small thing at all. "Then," he said, "I think you should tell me everything." She told him everything. Not quickly. There was no quick version of a story that spanned 40 years and 2 generations of grief, but efficiently, in the way she had learned to speak in council, clearly, without decoration, touching each fact and then moving forward. The mating ceremony, the first years of the reign, the year of Caius, short and blazing, and then gone. The 30 years of a hollow certainty that he was alive somewhere. Torben's illness, the pregnancy that had shocked every healer in the kingdom into a reverent and slightly panicked silence. Torben's death, quiet and merciful, 8 days ago now. Edren at her door with 4 guards and the admission. Careless, confident, the admission of a man who believed the person he was confessing to would never be in a position to repeat it. That it had been him. All of it. The nursemaid. The cradle. 30 years of a firstborn son raised as an orphan in the shadow of his own birthright. Finn listened without interrupting. This was, Elizabeth was beginning to understand, simply how he was built. He absorbed things whole before he responded to them, turned them over completely before he spoke. Brenna sat across the table and listened too, and her face was doing extraordinary things, cycling through outrage and grief and fury and compassion with the transparency of someone who had never learned, or never bothered, to conceal what she felt. When Elizabeth finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Brenna pressed both palms flat on the table. "I want to be very clear," she said, with the focused energy of someone selecting words carefully from a large available supply of much stronger ones. "That Edrin is an absolutely catastrophic human being, and if he comes to my door again, I will have significantly more than opinions prepared for him." "Brenna," Finn said gently. "I'm being restrained," she said. "This is me being restrained." "You're welcome." Finn looked at his hands for a moment, then at the pup, who had abandoned its defensive crouch and was now sitting beside Elizabeth's chair with its chin resting on her knee, as though it had made a decision about alliances and was not interested in further discussion on the matter. Then, at the mark on the inside of his own wrist, a habit, Elizabeth had noticed, something he did without seeming to know he was doing it, touching a spot just below the heel of his hand as though checking for something. "I need to see it," he said quietly. "The birthmark. I've always known it was there, but I've never known what it meant. The woman who raised me in the village, she said it was nothing, a common mark." "There is nothing common about it," Elizabeth said. "It is the seal of the first moon, the mark of the Alpha bloodline that has not broken in 11 generations. Every heir of the Torben line carries it, without exception." Finn turned his head. Elizabeth reached up as she had the night before, but this time he leaned into it slightly, the way the pup had pressed its nose into her palm, something instinctive moving faster than thought. Her fingers found the crescent mark behind his ear, and she let them rest there for just a moment, light as a question. "Your father," she said quietly, "touched this mark every single morning for the first year of your life. He said it was to make sure you were real." Finn's jaw moved. He looked away at the fire. He sounds... He stopped. He was, Elizabeth said simply. He absolutely was. A beat of silence, full and warm. Then Brenna, because she was Brenna, and the world did not stop requiring management simply because it was also being emotional, said, "Right. This is all extraordinarily significant, and I intend to feel all of it properly later tonight. But currently, we have a pressing logistical problem, which is that 2 of Idrin's guards know exactly where we are. And we have a Luna Queen, 7 unborn heirs, a foundling king, 1 very opinionated wolf pup, and 1 spoon between us and whatever comes next." She looked at Finn. "You know the northern passes better than anyone. We need a plan." Finn was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. "There is someone," he said, "in the highlands. About half a day's walk north. An elder. She's lived alone up there for as long as anyone can remember. The village people call her the Thorn Witch. She knows the old laws. She knows things about the bloodlines that no one else remembers." "You trust her?" Elizabeth asked. "I trust that she has never once in 30 years given anyone in the village a reason not to trust her." A pause. "She also made me soup once when I was 12, and it was significantly better than anyone else's soup, so my instincts are favorable." Brenna looked deeply offended. "Better than mine?" "Different than yours." "That's a diplomatic non-answer." "It's the only answer I'm giving before you pack us a bag." Brenna stood up with the energy of someone who had been waiting for a task and was extremely ready to execute it. Fine, I'll pack. But I want it noted that I am doing this under protest regarding the soup commentary, and we will revisit this." She was already moving, already opening the cupboard, already pulling things down with efficient purpose. "How much food for how many of us, including the pup?" "Pack for 4, Finn said. "And pack for difficult terrain." Brenna paused, turned, looked at Elizabeth with the particular expression of a woman doing arithmetic and not loving the result. "Difficult terrain," she repeated. "With..." She gestured at Elizabeth's considerable belly. "I have walked further on worse," Elizabeth said serenely. Brenna turned back to the cupboard. "I'm bringing extra blankets," she said, to no one in particular. "And the spoon." They left within the hour. The frost had not yet softened on the road when the 3 of them, and the pup, who had appointed itself Elizabeth's personal escort and took this role with extraordinary seriousness, moved north through the long grass, away from the farmhouse and the frost-hard yard, and the barn where this had all begun less than 12 hours ago. Elizabeth walked steadily. Her feet still ached. She did not mention this. At one point, navigating a rocky rise in the path, she felt Finn's hand at her elbow, not grabbing, not directing, just present, a steadying weight that asked nothing and offered everything. And she thought of Torben, who had walked beside her the same way for 40 years, and she breathed through it and kept walking. "Can I ask you something?" Finn said, when they had crested the rise and the highlands opened out ahead of them in a sweep of silver-gray grass and pale sky. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "What was he like?" A beat. "My father." She considered the question the way it deserved, not quickly. "He laughed loudly," she said finally. "At things other people didn't find funny. He was terrible at remembering names, but remembered every face he had ever seen. He argued with the council like it was a sport he genuinely loved, and then went home and worried about every decision for 3 days afterward." A pause. "He cried when you were born. He tried to hide it and was completely unsuccessful." Finn was quiet for a moment. "He sounds," he said again. "He was," Elizabeth said again. And this time, the smallest possible smile reached the corner of her mouth. He absolutely was. Behind them, Brenna was explaining to the pup, who had paused to investigate something in the grass, that they did not have time for distractions, and that whatever that smell was, it was not worth the delay, and that she had a schedule and intended to keep it. The pup ignored her completely. Also very much like someone else I've met recently, Elizabeth said quietly, more to herself than to Finn. Finn looked at her sidelong. The stubbornness, she clarified, is hereditary. He made a sound that might, in better circumstances, have developed into a laugh. Ahead, the highlands rose and darkened, and somewhere in them, an elder who knew the old laws was waiting without knowing she was waiting, and Edrin's guards were already turning their horses south to report, and the world was moving in the way it moves when something that has been held too long out of its right place finally begins, with great and inevitable force, to return. The highlands smelled of heather and cold stone, and something else. Something older, turned into the earth like a root that had been growing underground for longer than anyone had thought to measure. Elizabeth noticed it first. Of course she did. Her wolf had been paying attention to the air since they left the farmhouse, cataloging everything with the quiet industry of a creature that trusts its nose more than its eyes. The ordinary scents of the hill, frost, grass, the distant sharpness of a stream running fast over rocks, and then, threaded through all of it, that other thing. Not a warning, not quite a welcome. Something in between, the particular resonance of very old magic that has been tended carefully for a very long time. She knows we're coming, Elizabeth said. She always does, Finn said. I used to think it was because sound carries strangely up here. Then I was 12 and she opened the door before I knocked and said, "Come in, Finn. The tea is already poured." And I revised my theory. What's the current theory? Brenna asked, slightly out of breath from the last incline, the pup trotting with maddening ease at her heels. She simply knows things, Finn said. I've made peace with it. The cottage appeared as they came around a long curve in the path. Small, low, built into the hillside so naturally that it looked less constructed than grown, like the hill had simply decided to put out a room. Smoke from a peat fire. Window light, warm and amber. A door the color of old oak. It opened before they reached it. The woman in the doorway was not what Brenna had expected. This was clear from the small, involuntary noise Brenna made, quickly suppressed, but present. The Thorn Witch was perhaps the most ordinary-looking person Elizabeth had ever seen, which was itself extraordinary. Medium height, white hair braided simply back, a face that had been lived in thoroughly and without apology, with eyes the color of deep, still water that held, when they landed on you, the particular quality of attention that made you feel simultaneously seen and slightly audited. She looked at Finn. You took longer than I expected. We had a situation with some guards, Finn said. I know. Her gaze moved to Elizabeth, and something shifted in it. Not surprise, but a deepening, like a well revealing its own extent. Luna, she said, and the word carried a weight that had nothing to do with title and everything to do with recognition. Come inside, all of you. The pup too. But he is not to touch the blue shelf. The jars on the blue shelf are not for pups. The pup, who had been eyeing the door with intent, redirected its attention to the middle distance with an expression of elaborate innocence. He understands you? Brenna asked. Everything understands me, the old woman said without particular pride, simply as information. I'm Thessaly. Sit down before you fall down, Luna. You've been on your feet long enough. The inside of Thessaly's cottage was a taxonomy of everything that had ever been known about the old world. Bundles of dried plants in quantities that suggested serious intent. Jars of things in colors that had no business existing in nature. Books stacked with the comfortable disorder of things consulted often and replaced hastily. A table worn smooth by decades of use, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs that appeared somehow to have been expecting exactly 4 visitors. Elizabeth sat. The relief of sitting was profound, and she allowed herself to feel it privately without showing it on her face. Tea arrived on the table by a process Brenna watched very carefully, and then decided not to ask about. Thessaly sat across from Elizabeth and looked at her steadily, and Elizabeth looked back, and between the two of them passed the kind of wordless assessment that happens between women of a certain experience. A rapid, complete, mutual evaluation that established in approximately 4 seconds that they were both going to speak plainly, and neither of them had patience for anything else. "You know who I am," Elizabeth said. "I've known you were coming for 11 months, Thessaly said. "Since the night of the blood moon, when the Veil of Seven opened." "The Veil of Seven," Elizabeth repeated. Thessaly folded her hands on the table. "There is a law older than kingdoms," she said, "older than alpha bloodlines, older than the first ceremony of the first moon, the law of the sevenfold claim. It has not been invoked in 400 years. She paused. "It requires a perfect convergence, a luna of unbroken heart, a king's blood, and the birth of seven. When all three exist simultaneously, the veil opens. It cannot be closed by human hands or by any authority that does not understand what it is." The cottage was very quiet. "What does it mean?" Finn asked carefully. "When the veil opens?" Thessaly looked at him with those deep, still eyes. "It means," she said, "that the bloodline cannot be suppressed. It means that every attempt to deny, hide, or erase the true heirs will, from the moment of the veil's opening, begin to unravel. Edrin's claim is already weakening. He simply does not yet realize it." A pause. "He will know it when the pups arrive. The veil announces them. Every wolf within 100 miles will feel it. Every elder who knows the old law will know what it means." "And those who don't know the old law?" Brenna asked. "We'll learn very quickly," Thessaly said, "when 7 heirs of the Torben bloodline draw their first breath, and the sky does what it does." "What does it do?" Brenna asked. "You'll see," Thessaly said, with the composure of someone who has seen it before and found it entirely worth watching. Elizabeth pressed her hand against her belly. The 7 were quieter today, the focused quiet of creatures nearing their time, conserving, gathering inward. She knew that quiet. She had felt it before, once, 30 years ago, and the memory of it now was both sweet and devastating. "How long?" she asked Thessaly quietly. Thessaly looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, kindness, but was something adjacent to it, something that had been forged in a longer fire. "Soon," she said, "before the next full moon." 4 days. "And Edrin?" Finn asked. "We'll move faster than he has been," Thessaly said. "He has people in the Highlands, not many, but some. He'll know by nightfall that she's here." She looked at Finn again, that auditing look, and this time something in it softened fractionally, like stone that has been warmed long enough to give slightly at the surface. "You have a decision to make, boy." "I'm 30, Finn said mildly. "Yes," Thessaly agreed. "A boy." She unfolded her hands and set one flat on the table, palm up, the same old greeting Elizabeth had given the pup that morning, the wolfkin gesture. "The sevenfold claim requires a witness of the bloodline to be present at the birth. Present and willing and named. Not forced. Not coerced. Chosen. A beat. You are the only living member of the Torben bloodline who can stand as that witness. If you choose not to, the veil still opens, but the claim will be contested. It will be years of challenge and counterclaim, and Edrin will have time to build walls against it." "And if I choose to stand?" Finn asked. "Then the sevenfold claim is witnessed, sealed, and unassailable." Thessaly held his gaze. "And you will have acknowledged before the law and the moon and whatever gods still pay attention that you are Caius, firstborn son of Torben and Elizabeth of the Eastern Realm." The fire shifted. Brenna was very still, the stillest Elizabeth had seen her, all that warm, restless energy folded inward, waiting. Finn looked at his hands. At the mark on his wrist he always touched without knowing he was doing it. at the pup, who had spent the last 5 minutes edging incrementally toward the blue shelf, and was currently pretending to be asleep in a position that placed it in ideal striking distance. "Not the blue shelf," Finn said without looking up. The pup opened one eye, reconsidered, relocated, and then Finn looked at Elizabeth, at the woman who had told him the truth in a warm kitchen with flour still on the table and grief still raw in her voice and her spine absolutely straight. And he said very simply, "I don't need more time." Elizabeth breathed. "I have spent 30 years not knowing who I was," he continued, and his voice was the low, careful one, but steadier now, the way a river is steadiest at its deepest point. "I have a wife I love and a life I built, and I am not setting any of it down. But if there are 7 pups who are my brothers and sisters, and a woman at this table who is my mother, and a throne that belongs to them, and not to the man who has been stealing from this family for 3 decades. He stopped. "I don't need more time," he said again. The silence that followed was the kind that deserves to be left alone. Thessaly nodded once, with the brevity of someone who had been hoping for exactly that answer and had not been certain of receiving it. Brenna made a sound that was absolutely not crying. "I'm not crying," she confirmed, to no one in particular. "Of course not," Elizabeth said. It's the heather. It gets in. The heather is outside, Brenna." "It travels," Brenna said firmly, and pressed her sleeve to her eyes with great dignity. Outside, the highland wind moved through the grass, long and cold and carrying things from far away. And in the east, though none of them could see it from inside the cottage, a cloud formation that had been building since mid-morning broke apart in a way that made 2 of Edrin's scouts, camped on a ridge half a day south, look up at the sky with an unease they could not name, only feel, in the bone, in the blood, in the oldest part of the animal they also were. Something had shifted. Something was coming. And for the first time in 400 years, the Veil of Seven was fully, irrevocably open. They heard the horses before they saw the torches. Thessaly heard them first, her head lifting from the maps she had been spreading across the table with the quiet urgency of someone who had been planning for this moment for 11 months and was not interested in being caught unprepared. She went still in the particular way of very old things that have learned to read the world through vibration rather than sound, her fingers pressing flat against the wood of the table as though the earth itself were sending information upward through the grain. 6, she said. No, 8. 2 hanging back on the ridge. 10 total, Finn said, already at the window, one hand pulling the edge of the shutter back a half-inch. He came himself, Elizabeth said. It was not a question. She could feel it, not through magic, not through any law older than kingdoms, but through 40 years of knowing Edrin's particular quality of presence, the way you know a bad weather system by the specific pressure it puts on the air before it arrives. He had always made rooms feel smaller. He had always carried with him the atmosphere of a man counting things that did not belong to him. Finn turned from the window. His face was controlled, but his eyes were doing the thing, that deep, gathering stillness that was no longer merely patience and had not been since the morning in the kitchen. "There's a passage," he said, looking at Thessaly. "The old shepherd's cut, northeast of the ridge. I used it as a boy. If we move now—" "She cannot run," Thessaly said, without cruelty, looking at Elizabeth. "Not tonight." The words landed in the room with their full weight. Elizabeth did not flinch from them. She knew. She had known since mid-afternoon, when the particular deep pressure had begun. Not pain, not yet. But the body's first long exhalation of preparation, the internal tide beginning its irreversible turn. She had said nothing because there had been other things to do, and she was not in the habit of announcing difficulty until it became unavoidable. It had become unavoidable. "Elizabeth," Brenna said from across the room in a voice stripped entirely of its usual brightness. Just her name. Just that. I'm all right, Elizabeth said. You are not all right, you are— Brenna stopped, crossed the room in 4 steps, took Elizabeth's hand without asking. Tell me what you need. Time, Elizabeth said quietly. Which we don't have. Outside, the sound of hooves slowed, stopped. The torchlight through the shutter gaps painted moving amber lines across the cottage walls. Then a voice. And yes, there it was, exactly as she had known it would be. Edrin's voice, carrying the particular practiced ease of a man who had spent decades learning to sound like he owned every room he walked into. I know you're in there, Elizabeth. I know the boy is with you. A pause, calculated for effect. I'm not here for trouble. I'm here to offer terms. He's here for trouble, Brenna said very quietly. Deeply, Finn agreed. Thessaly was already moving, not toward the door, but to the far wall, her hands finding jars and bundles with the efficiency of long practice, assembling something on the table with a focus that did not invite interruption. The pup had positioned itself at the base of the door with its ears flat and its hackles raised in a ridge from neck to tail, producing that deep, chest-borne sound again, the one that was too large for its body. Finn looked at Elizabeth. I'm going to go out. You are not, Elizabeth said. He doesn't know what I know, Finn said. He doesn't know I've spoken with Thessaly. He doesn't know about the 7-fold claim, or what I've agreed to, or that the veil is already open. He thinks I'm a farmer who found a stray woman in his barn. A beat. That's an advantage. Let me use it. The logic was sound. She hated that the logic was sound. Brenna stays with me, Elizabeth said. Obviously, Brenna said, squeezing her hand. You do not engage him on the question of his authority over the kingdom, Elizabeth continued, looking at Finn. Not tonight, not here, not without witnesses and the formal invocation. I understand. Finn. Her voice came out differently on his name, not the Luna's voice, not the Queen's voice. Something older, something that had been waiting 30 years for a reason to exist. Be careful. He looked at her for a moment with those dark Torban eyes, and something moved across his face, quick, warm, gone before it could be named. I will, he said, and then so quietly she almost missed it. I'll come back. He went out. Edrin was exactly as she had imagined. Finn had seen him twice before from a distance, at regional gatherings where the Eastern delegation passed through the Highland territories, and had found him entirely forgettable. Medium build, well-dressed, the face of a man who smiled often enough that the smile had stopped meaning anything. But up close, in torchlight, with 8 armed men arranged behind him in the careful geometry of a threat that wanted to look like an escort, something else was visible. Something in the set of the jaw, and the quality of the eyes. Intelligent, restless, the eyes of someone doing constant arithmetic about who in any given room was a problem, and what kind of problem they were. Those eyes assessed Finn now with rapid, professional efficiency. You're the farmer, Edrin said. Not an insult, just a categorization. I'm the man whose door you're standing outside at night with armed company, Finn said pleasantly. Those are both true things. Something flickered in Edrin's expression. Recalibration. He had expected, Finn suspected, someone easier to wrong foot. The woman inside is a guest, Finn said. An elderly woman I found in need of shelter. I'd expect most men to consider that a simple act of hospitality, rather than a matter requiring armed response. The woman inside, Edrin said again, with the patience of someone choosing not to be redirected, is carrying property of the Eastern realm. The word property landed in the cold air between them. Finn was quiet for a moment. The Highland wind moved through the grass. Behind Edrin, one of the horses shifted and stamped, breath steaming in the dark. She mentioned you might put it that way, Finn said. Did she? She also mentioned, Finn continued conversationally, that you have a habit of taking things that don't belong to you, that you've been doing it for 30 years, That you're very good at it. He held Edrin's gaze. And that you're not used to anyone being in a position to say so. The atmosphere between them changed. Not dramatically. Edrin was too controlled for drama, but perceptibly, the way temperature changes when a cloud moves over the sun. Careful, Edrin said softly. You don't know what you're involved in, farmer. I'm learning quickly, Finn said. Inside the cottage, Elizabeth closed her eyes and breathed through the deepening pressure, and listened to her son stand in the dark in front of the man who had stolen 30 years from both of them and hold his ground without flinching. And she thought, Torben, you should hear him. You should be here to hear him. The grief and the pride arrived together, which was, she supposed, how it would always be. I'll offer you this once, Edrin said outside. Step away from your door. Let my men in. Walk away tonight and forget everything the woman told you, and I will ensure that no one has reason to remember your name or your farm. That's a generous offer, Finn said. It is. I'm going to decline it. A long pause. Then we do this the other way, Edrin said, and nodded to the men behind him. What happened next lasted 4 minutes and felt like 40. The first 2 guards moved toward the door and found Finn not retreating, which appeared to genuinely surprise them. The third came around the side of the cottage looking for another entrance, and discovered with significant alarm that the pup had exited through the back window at some point in the preceding minutes and was now outside, no longer small, seeming at all, positioned between the guard and the cottage wall with a composure that suggested it had been waiting for exactly this. The guard stopped. The pup looked at him. Good decision, Finn said from the front. Inside, Thessaly had finished whatever she had been assembling on the table. She pressed a small cloth bundle into Elizabeth's free hand, the one not occupied by Brenna's grip, and said very quietly, Hold this. Don't open it. Don't ask me what it is until morning. Thessaly, the Veil of Seven does not open twice, Thessaly said, with the focused calm of someone describing an observable fact. But it can be anchored. When your pups arrive, this will ensure that every elder within range who knows the old law will feel the anchor. Not just sense it, feel it, in their blood, in their shift. Edrin cannot silence what is written in every wolf's bone. Elizabeth closed her hand around the bundle. Outside there was the sound of a scuffle. Brief, not violent, the particular controlled physicality of someone who knows exactly how much force is sufficient, and applies exactly that much and nothing more. Then the sound of Edrin's voice, for the first time carrying something other than practiced ease. Surprised. Just slightly. Just enough. What are you? And then, who are you? Finn's answer, when it came, was quiet enough that the wind nearly took it. But Elizabeth heard it. She was a wolf, and her son's voice had been imprinted somewhere below hearing, somewhere in the bone, for 30 years. My name, Finn said, is Caius, first of the Torben line, and you are standing on land that has given shelter to the Luna Queen, who carries the 7 heirs to the throne you are currently borrowing. A pause. I'd like it back. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elizabeth had ever heard. And then, beneath her hands, beneath the wool, beneath everything, the 7 moved. All of them. Together. Not their usual restless shifting, but something coordinated, deliberate, a collective turning toward the world outside as though they had been listening, and had decided, unanimously, that now was the moment to make their intentions known. The cloth bundle in her hand grew warm. Outside, Edrin's voice cracked at the edges for the first time in 40 years of knowing him. That's not possible. I made sure. You made a mistake, Finn said simply. Come inside, Edrin. We have things to discuss. He didn't come inside. What he did was something that would cost him later. The decision of a man whose plan has just collapsed and who reacts with the thing he has always used when strategy fails: force without elegance. He gave an order, short and sharp, and 2 guards stepped forward, but they did not complete their movement. And the sky, the clear highland sky that had been dark and simple and full of ordinary stars, did something. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't thunder. It was older than both. A pulse of silver light, low on the horizon, spreading outward from the north like a slow breath, and with it a sound not quite a sound, more a resonance, felt in the jaw, in the chest, in the oldest animal part of the brain, that swept across the hills and the valleys and the sleeping villages below, and touched every wolf within 100 miles in the blood. The Veil of Seven, fully anchored. Adrian's guards stopped moving. One of them, the tall one who had come to the farmhouse that morning and chosen the first option and been grateful for it, turned to look at Edrin with an expression that had nothing professional left in it. Just a man looking at another man, understanding for the first time the exact nature of what he had been asked to serve. "My lord," he said slowly, "what have you done?" Edrin said nothing. And in the cottage, with Brenna's hand in hers and Thessaly's bundle warm in her palm, and 7 heirs announcing themselves to 100 miles of wakened wolves, Elizabeth pressed her lips together against the first real wave of pain and thought. With a clarity that pain sometimes brings, cutting through everything unnecessary. Not long now. Not long. She had asked for no ceremony. This was, Brenna had informed her, an entirely reasonable request that she was going to honor completely while also doing absolutely everything in her power to make it as right as circumstances allowed. This was Brenna's compromise position, and she had presented it with the firmness of someone who had arrived at it after significant internal negotiation and was not open to counteroffers. So there was no ceremony, but there was firelight. There were Thessaly's dried herbs burning in a small clay dish, filling the air with something ancient and clean. There was a bed prepared with more competence and speed than seemed possible given the available materials. There was Brenna, stationed with the focus of a general who has found her particular theater of expertise, talking in a low, steady voice, sometimes practical, sometimes nonsensical, sometimes just words chosen because their sound was the right shape for the moment. And the sound of her was, without question, the thing Elizabeth held on to through the long hours of the night. Finn stayed outside. This was the custom. The firstborn of a bloodline witnessing the sevenfold claim did not enter the birth space but stood at its boundary, present and named, the bridge between the bloodline's past and its continuation. Thessaly had explained this to him with her characteristic economy of words, and he had nodded and taken up his position outside the cottage door and remained there through the hours without complaint, in the cold, in the dark, which Elizabeth knew because every time the door opened a crack, she could see the outline of him, still and solid against the Highland night. The pup stayed with him. They had not discussed this. It had simply happened, the pup settling at his heel like something decided. Brenna, at some point in the second hour, leaned close and said, "You know, most people, going through what you're going through, would make at least some noise about it." "I have made noise," Elizabeth said with great dignity. "You made one sound," Brenna said. "Once. It was extremely restrained, and I want you to know I found it both impressive and slightly alarming. I was a queen for 40 years. Queens are apparently made of something different than the rest of us." "Everyone is made of the same thing," Elizabeth said, through a long, controlled exhale. "I simply had more practice deciding what to do with it." Brenna was quiet for a moment. Elizabeth. After this, after all of this is done, and the heirs are safe, and Edrin is dealt with, and everything is as it should be." She paused. "You're not going to disappear, are you? Back to the kingdom, back behind the castle walls. You're not going to become someone I only know about from the outside." Elizabeth turned her head and looked at her. This young woman who had walked into a barn with a lantern and a spoon, and no hesitation, and offered everything she had. This woman who had held her hand through the longest night, and talked when talk was needed, and was quiet when quiet was needed, and who was, Elizabeth had decided somewhere in the third hour, entirely irreplaceable. "No," Elizabeth said. "I am not." Brenna's face did the thing it did. Every emotion visible, nothing concealed. The absolute transparency of someone who has never needed armor because she has never stopped moving. She looked away quickly. "Good," she said, "because I have extensive opinions about the governance of Eastern kingdoms, and I intend to share all of them." "I assumed," Elizabeth said. They arrived as the sky began to lighten. One after another, not all at once, because nothing about this had ever been simple or symmetrical or convenient. Small and dark-furred, and insistently, furiously alive. Thessaly received each one with the matter-of-fact reverence of someone for whom miracles had never stopped being miraculous, but had long since stopped being surprising. Brenna, for perhaps the third time tonight, made the sound she maintained was not crying. Each one, as Thessaly held them briefly in the open air of the cottage, turned their small, dark face toward the door, toward the boundary, toward the firstborn of the bloodline standing in the cold on the other side of the threshold. By the fourth, Finn's voice came through the door, very quiet, barely above the wind. "I'm here. I'm right here." By the seventh, Brenna had entirely abandoned the pretense of not crying and was doing it openly and without apology, which Elizabeth found, through the extraordinary exhaustion of the last several hours, deeply comforting. "7," Thessaly said, for the formal record in the old tongue that predated kingdoms. And then, in the way of the sevenfold claim, she spoke 7 names to the open air, names Elizabeth had carried in her heart for 8 months, names she had chosen the way she had once chosen Caius, before the ceremony, against tradition, because they were already real before they arrived. At the 7th name, the cloth bundle in Elizabeth's hand, which she had held through all of it, through every hour without opening, grew briefly, intensely warm, and then went quiet. Done. Sealed. Irrevocable. Outside, the pulse of silver light from the highland sky intensified for one long moment, visible even through the walls, painting everything white-silver and ancient and clean, and then faded, leaving ordinary dawn in its place, pale gold and unhurried, moving across the hills the way mornings move when they do not yet know they are significant. The door opened, Finn stepped inside, and he stopped, and he stood at the edge of the room with the expression of a man absorbing something too large to fit inside normal human capacity, which was the correct response, because it was too large. 7 small, dark-furred pups, each turning toward him with the instinctive recognition of bloodline, and a woman sitting against the headboard with exhaustion written into every line of her face and her spine still, somehow straight. He crossed the room and crouched beside her, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing equal to the moment available in language. Elizabeth looked at him, her son, 30 years found, crouching in a healer's cottage in the Highland dawn with his eyes full of something that would take a lifetime to name. And she reached out and put her hand against his face the way she had in the kitchen, the way she had been doing it in her mind for 3 decades without knowing who the face belonged to. "Your father," she said quietly, "would have been insufferable about this, in the best possible way." Finn made the sound again, the one that was almost a laugh. This time it became 1, and Brenna, from somewhere behind them, said, voice thick, spoon inexplicably still in hand, "I want it noted that I was here for all of this, and that I handled it with extraordinary grace." "You cried," Thessaly said. "With extraordinary grace," Brenna maintained. Outside, the Highland morning expanded across the hills, and somewhere in the east, in a kingdom that had been holding its breath, every wolf elder who knew the old law felt the anchor of the sevenfold claim settle into their bones, like a truth that had been waiting to be told, and turned as one toward the north. And in the corridor of the eastern castle, Edrin stood at a window and watched the sky and felt, for the first time in 40 years of careful, patient, meticulous theft, the specific cold sensation of something irreversibly slipping from his hands. He had made a mistake. He had left her alive. He had left them all alive. And now the veil was sealed, and the firstborn was named, and 7 heirs of the Torben bloodline were breathing the Highland air and turning their small faces toward a dawn that belonged, irrevocably and by the oldest law in the world, to them. He had one move left. He intended to use it. 3 days passed in the Highland cottage like held breath. Thessaly's home, which had felt small upon arrival, revealed itself to be one of those spaces that expands according to need. An extra room discovered through a door Brenna was almost certain had not existed on the first day. A cellar stocked with more provisions than its exterior suggested possible. A well in the back that produced water so cold and clean it tasted like the beginning of things. Elizabeth slept and woke and fed her pups, and slept again. And in the hours between, she sat by the fire with the focused stillness of a woman sorting through an enormous internal inventory. Grief, joy, exhaustion, purpose, and deciding where each thing belonged. Finn stayed. This surprised him slightly, the ease of it. He had expected to feel pulled back toward the farmhouse, toward the ordinary life he had built stone by careful stone over 30 years. Instead, he found himself sitting across from Elizabeth in the evenings, while Brenna managed the logistics of the cottage with her characteristic organized chaos, and talking, carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all, about things he had never said to anyone. What it had been like to grow up without a name that meant something. The specific loneliness of being the child who looked slightly different from everyone in the village and could never explain why. The way he had learned, young, to be still and quiet and patient, because those were the tools available to a boy who had no bloodline to stand on. Elizabeth listened to all of it without flinching, which was the thing he needed, and told him in return about things she had also never said to anyone. The exact quality of the silence in the castle after Caius disappeared, and how Torben used to stand at the window in the eastern tower for years afterward, not looking at anything particular, just standing there as though proximity to the direction his son had been taken in was the best he could do. "He would have loved meeting you," Elizabeth said one evening, with the simplicity of a statement that was also the largest thing she had said all week. Finn was quiet for a long time. "I think," he said finally, "I would have argued with him constantly." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "He would have been delighted." It was Thessaly who saw it coming. She had been on the roof, a habit Brenna had chosen to stop questioning, when she came down the ladder with the brisk, unhurried energy of someone who has seen what they expected to see and is now moving directly to the appropriate response. "He's not coming with guards this time," she said. Everyone in the cottage went still. "He found something," Thessaly continued, moving to the table where her maps were spread, touching one with 2 fingers. "Something old. There is a counter law to the sevenfold claim. It hasn't been used in recorded history, but it exists. A thing called the Right of Ash." She looked up. "If the witness of the claim is prevented from standing before the new moon seals it permanently, the anchor breaks, the veil retreats, the heir's claim becomes contestable again." The fire crackled. Elizabeth understood immediately, completely, and with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "Finn." "He's not coming for you," Thessaly confirmed, looking at Finn directly. "He intends to challenge the firstborn's claim before the new moon." Finn received this information in his characteristic way, absorbing it fully before responding, turning it completely over. Then he looked at Elizabeth and said, with the particular quiet that was no longer patience, but something forged, "How long until the new moon seals it?" "Dawn tomorrow," Thessaly said. "He knows this. He will come tonight." "How many?" "Not many. This is not a show of force. He can't afford one, not now that the elders know. This is a surgical move. 3, perhaps 4. And Edrin himself, because he won't trust this to anyone else. Brenna set down the cup she was holding with a precise, controlled movement. Right, she said. Right. So we need a plan that keeps Finn alive until dawn, keeps Elizabeth and the pups safe, and ideally ends with Edrin in a position where he cannot do this again. She looked around the room. I'm open to suggestions. I have the spoon, but I acknowledge it has limitations. I have something better than a spoon, Thessaly said, and opened the cellar door. What Thessaly kept in her cellar was not weapons, it was letters. 40 years of them, Elizabeth discovered. Correspondence with every wolf elder in the known territories, carefully preserved, written in the old script. Documentation, testimony. Records that Thessaly had been quietly, methodically assembling for decades, because she had known, in the way she knew most things, that this accounting would eventually be required. I have been waiting, Thessaly said simply, setting the bound collection on the table, for the right moment to present this to the right person. She looked at Elizabeth. The moment is now. The person is you. Elizabeth pressed her hand flat on the topmost letter and felt, beneath the parchment, 40 years of patient, relentless truth-keeping. Her throat tightened once, briefly. She allowed it. The elders need to see this tonight, Finn said, before Edrin moves. 2 of them are already riding north, Thessaly said. They felt the veil seal 3 days ago and they know what it means. They'll arrive by midnight. And if Edrin arrives before midnight? Thessaly looked at him steadily. Then you hold. Edrin came at the 2nd hour of the night, as predicted. 4 men, as predicted. And himself, on foot, which surprised Finn until he understood it. Horses made noise, and Edrin had spent 40 years understanding that silence was its own kind of power. He came through the back of the cottage rather than the front, which was clever, and would have worked on a different night, with a different set of inhabitants. But Thessaly had no back entrance that she had not already accounted for, and the pup, who had been sleeping with one ear technically open since sunset, was at the gap in the stones before any of the 4 men reached it, solid and alert and considerably larger than anyone who had not seen him 3 days ago would have expected. The men stopped. Edrin did not. He came through the gap himself, moving around the pup with the careful confidence of someone who has calculated the risk of a young wolf against the necessity of the task, and decided he can manage it. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. What he found in the cottage was not what he had planned for. Elizabeth, seated at the table, with her spine straight and her hands folded over the letters, and her 7 pups asleep in the makeshift beds Brenna had constructed with militant competence. Brenna, standing to the left with an expression that had moved some distance past opinions into something considerably more focused. Thessaly, in her chair by the fire, watching Edrin with the expression of a woman watching an event she has long anticipated and finds somewhat less interesting than the outcome that follows it. And Finn standing at the center of the room, directly in front of his mother, with the absolute stillness of the Alpha bloodline's oldest instinct, awake and fully present in every line of him. Edrin looked at him. Finn looked at Edrin. For the first time, with Finn standing in firelight at his full height with the crescent mark visible and the veil's resonance still humming in the bones of anyone with wolf blood in the room. For the first time, Edrin looked at the man he had taken from his cradle 30 years ago and knew him. The recognition moved across his face like a wave hitting rock. You have no idea, Edrin said, and his voice was different now, stripped of its practiced ease, carrying something raw beneath it. Not remorse, not exactly, but the particular weight of a man who has been carrying a large, heavy thing for a very long time and is too exhausted to pretend otherwise. How careful I was. How many times I made sure. You were supposed to grow up and never know. It was supposed to be clean. It was never right. It was just hidden. There's a difference. I did what was necessary. You took a child from his mother, Finn said, in the tone of someone stating a fact. Because you were afraid of what he represented. What they all represented. His eyes moved briefly to Elizabeth and back. You've been afraid for 40 years. That's an exhausting way to live. Something moved in Edrin's face. Not softening. Something more complicated. The expression of a man hearing the truth from the mouth of someone he wronged and being unable, despite every instinct, to fully refuse it. Step away from her, Edrin said, and his voice had lost its steadiness now, the architecture of his self-possession developing visible cracks. Step away, and this ends here. I'll go. I won't come back. The pups can have what's theirs when they're grown. Just... No, Finn said. One word, no decoration. Caius, don't. The name from Edrin's mouth was clearly the wrong thing, and Edrin knew it the moment he said it. You don't get to use that name. The door opened. Not Edrin's men. They were still outside, navigating the increasingly insistent objections of the pup. Two figures in the doorway, travel-worn, carrying the particular authority of people who have ridden fast from a long distance on a matter of great importance. Elder wolves, a woman with white-streaked hair and a man whose face carried the specific weathered dignity of someone who has been keeping the old law for a very long time. They looked at the room, at Elizabeth, at the letters on the table, at Finn, at the crescent mark behind Finn's ear, visible in the firelight. The woman elder said, in the old tongue, the formal phrase of recognition, 3 words that Elizabeth had not heard spoken aloud in 30 years, words that meant, roughly translated, the bloodline is present and witnessed and true. Edrin went very still. It's done, Thessaly said from her chair, mildly. It's been done since dawn 3 days ago. This... She gestured at Edrin with the composure of someone waving away a mild inconvenience, is merely the last formality of a plan that ended before it began. Edrin looked around the room, at the elders, at Thessaly's letters, 40 years of documentation, opened now, spread across the table where the elder woman was already reading with the focused attention of someone confirming what she had suspected for decades. At Elizabeth, who was looking back at him with an expression that had no anger in it. Something more difficult than anger, something that required more of him to receive. Clarity. The clear-eyed regard of a woman who has every right to fury and has chosen understanding instead, not for his sake, but because she is done carrying the weight of his failures. It's over, Edrin, Elizabeth said quietly. You can stop now. He stood in the firelight of Thessaly's cottage, surrounded by everything he had spent 40 years trying to prevent, and the most terrible thing was not that he had lost. The most terrible thing was the expression on his face when he finally, fully understood that the losing had been inevitable, that the veil of 7, the bloodline, the letters, the firstborn standing 12 feet away with his father's eyes, had all been building toward this moment like water building behind a wall, patient and inevitable and entirely indifferent to his objections. He sat down, not dramatically, not with collapse, simply sat in Brenna's chair by the window. Brenna noted this with visible emotion but held her tongue, with the slow movement of a man putting down something very heavy. Outside, his 4 guards stood uncertain in the Highland dark. The pup, apparently satisfied that the crisis had resolved, shook itself briskly and sat down. And Brenna, because the world continued to require management regardless of historical significance, said, I'm going to make tea. I'm making it for everyone, including you. This to Edrin, with the tone of someone who disagrees with a person's entire life but will not have it said they were inhospitable. Because it is the middle of the night and we are all going to be reasonable adults about this if it is the last thing I accomplish. Edrin looked at her. Thank you, he said, after a moment. It came out strangely. Unused, the word, like something found in the back of a drawer that had not been opened in years. Brenna put the kettle on. The new moon sealed the 7-fold claim at the precise moment the first light touched the eastern ridge. Not with drama, not with silver pulse or Highland sky illumination, but with the quiet, absolute finality of a door closing on everything that had come before. Elizabeth felt it in her hands, in the bone, in the oldest, deepest part of the wolf that had carried this bloodline through 40 years of joy and grief and survival. Done. She was sitting outside Thessaly's cottage when it happened. The elder woman had suggested fresh air with the authority of someone whose suggestions were not actually suggestions, and the Highland morning was the kind that made no apologies for its beauty, wide and pale gold and smelling of frost and heather, and the cold clarity of a world that had been rinsed clean overnight. The elder wolves had been inside with Edren and the letters since before dawn. The process of formal accounting, of laying 40 years of documented theft and cruelty before the oldest applicable law, was not quick, and it was not meant to be. It was deliberate, thorough, and witnessed, which were the three things that mattered. Finn came and sat beside her on the stone bench outside the door. He had not slept. Neither had she. They shared the morning without speaking for a while, which was something she was discovering they were both comfortable with. The Torben quality of silence, the ability to be present without filling the space. "What happens to him?" Finn asked eventually. "The elders will convene a formal reckoning," Elizabeth said. "Under the old law, an alpha who acts against the bloodline and its Luna can be stripped of all territory, all standing, all claim. He will not be harmed." A pause. "He will simply be removed from everything he spent 40 years accumulating." "Is that enough?" Finn asked. Not with anger, with the genuine curiosity of someone trying to understand how justice worked in a world older than the one he'd grown up in. Elizabeth considered the question honestly. "I have spent 30 years wanting my son back," she said. "I have spent the last 8 days wanting my husband back. Neither of those things is possible, and no accounting changes that." She looked east, toward the direction of a kingdom that would need, in the coming weeks, an enormous amount of careful, deliberate work. What is possible is that the people Edron would have continued to harm, the Seven, the kingdom, every wolf who served under a false regent, are protected, that the bloodline is restored, that the record is clear. A pause. "That is enough. Not because it is all I want, but because it is all that is real." Finn was quiet for a moment. "You're extraordinarily wise," he said, in the tone of someone making an observation rather than a compliment. "I'm extremely old and very tired," Elizabeth said. "At a certain point, they become the same thing." He made the sound, the almost laugh, and this time it became a full one, quiet and real, and she turned to look at him in the morning light. Her son, 30 years of a missing face finally present and accounted for. And she let herself simply look at him without bracing against anything, without the weight of grief or urgency or survival pressing the moment flat. He looked like Torben around the jaw, like herself around the eyes, like no one she had ever seen in the particular quality of his stillness, which was entirely his own. A thing he had built himself, in a village, without any of the context that should have been his, out of nothing but his own nature. She was, without qualification, proud of him. She told him so. He looked at the Highland morning for a long moment and did not say anything, and she understood that he was doing with the information what he always did, absorbing it fully before responding, turning it completely over, making sure he had it right before he committed to it. Then he said, "Thank you for not stopping looking." "I never stopped," she said simply. "I know," he said. I think I always knew, somewhere, that someone was looking. I couldn't have told you how I knew, but I did." The door opened and Brenna appeared, carrying 2 cups with the purposeful energy of someone who had been awake all night and had decided that the way to address this was through hot beverages and forward motion. She handed one to each of them and then sat on the ground beside the bench without ceremony, pulling her knees up, looking out at the Highland morning with the transparent appreciation of someone experiencing it for the first time. "The elders are nearly done inside," she said. Thessaly says another hour. A pause. Also, the pup found the blue shelf. Brenna. Nothing broke. Everything is fine. 2 jars were opened and 1 was tasted, and Thessaly said, and I quote, "It won't harm him. It will merely make him extremely forthright for the next several hours, and honestly, I'm not sure I'll notice the difference." Elizabeth pressed her lips together. "Are you smiling?" Brenna demanded, delighted. "I am not." "You absolutely are, I can see it." "I am resting my face." "That is a smile, Elizabeth. I've known you for 4 days, and I know your smile." "Drink your tea, Brenna." Brenna drank her tea, beaming. The formal reckoning took place at mid-morning, outside, in the Highland air, which was where such things were meant to happen under the old law. Open sky, open witness, no walls to contain or distort. Edrin stood before the 2 elders and Thessaly and gave his account. All of it. The elders had a quality of listening that made evasion feel structurally impossible, and he gave the account fully in the flat, careful voice of a man who had made his decisions with clear eyes and was now prepared to receive their consequences with the same clarity. Elizabeth listened from her place at the edge of the gathering, with the 7 pups asleep in a basket Brenna had somehow acquired, and Finn standing at her left side, and the elder woman standing at her right, and she let herself hear it, every year of it, every careful move, everything taken, and she breathed through all of it without looking away. When it was done, the elder man spoke the reckoning in the old tongue, and the elder woman witnessed it, and Thessaly sealed it with the letters, and it was recorded in the way that the old law recorded things, permanently, in bone and blood, and the deep memory of the wolfkin who were present. Edrin, stripped of standing and territory and the borrowed authority of a throne that had never been his, looked older than he had the night before. Not diminished, exactly. Just his actual size, finally, after a lifetime of the space he had artificially occupied. He looked at Elizabeth before he left. She met his eyes and held them, and she said, "I hope you find something worth building, for your own sake." A pause. "You were capable of it once, before you decided that taking was easier than earning." He opened his mouth, closed it, nodded once. He walked north, away from the Eastern Territories, with the 4 guards who had chosen, in the end, in the dark, when it mattered, to stand down rather than follow a wrong order. They walked without horses, which was the old law's particular poetry about the matter. Finn watched him go. "I thought I'd feel more," he said quietly. "You will," Elizabeth said. "Later, in pieces, over time. That's how these things arrive." "Is that from experience?" 40 years of it." He looked at her sideways. "Does it get easier?" "It gets different," she said. "At a certain point, different is enough." The Highland wind moved through the grass, long and cold, and carrying with it the smell of the season turning, winter retreating by degrees, something green and insistent pushing up beneath the frost. The morning was wide and clear, and entirely indifferent to its own significance, which was, Elizabeth thought, exactly right. Brenna appeared at Finn's other side and linked her arm through his with the easy certainty of a woman who knows exactly where she belongs. She looked at the landscape, and then at the basket where 7 small, dark shapes were beginning to stir in the warming air. "So," she said, "what happens now?" Elizabeth looked east, toward a kingdom that needed its Luna back, toward a throne that needed its rightful heirs acknowledged, toward a great hall that had been silenced and would need to be filled again with the ordinary, extraordinary noise of a bloodline continuing. Arguments and laughter and advisors reconsidering their positions mid-sentence, and a boy who had been taken from his cradle finally taking his place at a table that had been set for him since before he was born. Toward somewhere in the future, not near, not rushed, but present in the way that true things are present before they arrive, a life that she had not yet fully imagined. Someone had suggested in the past week that the Highland Territories had their own elder council, and that said council had expressed considerable interest in having a liaison from the restored Eastern realm. Someone had further suggested that this liaison role would benefit from a grounding presence, someone who knew the highlands and was trusted by the elders and also possessed, by all accounts, considerable competence in difficult terrain. The someone had been Thessaly, and she had been looking at Finn when she said it, and Brenna had immediately said absolutely yes before Finn could respond, and the matter had been decided in the way most matters involving Brenna were decided. "Now," Elizabeth said, "we go home." She said the word with the full weight of what it meant. Not just the castle, not just the kingdom, but the thing home actually was. The people standing beside her in the highland morning, the 7 stirring in the basket, the old woman in the cottage behind them who had kept the truth in letters for 40 years, because she believed someone would eventually come who needed it. The pup pressed against her leg from the left, warm and solid. "I am absolutely bringing the spoon," Brenna said, to no one in particular. "We assumed," Finn and Elizabeth said at exactly the same moment. Brenna looked between them with an expression of profound delight. "You're doing the same thing," she said. "You're making the same face. You have the same face when you're being dry. Finn, you've had this face your entire life, and I never knew where it came from, and now I know, and I have feelings about this." "Drink your tea, Brenna," Finn said. "I finished it." "Then let's walk," Elizabeth said. And they did. East, into the morning, into what came next, with the 7 asleep in Brenna's basket, and the pup at their heels, and the highland sky wide and pale above them, and the old law sealed and witnessed and permanent in the bone of the world, and everything that had been taken beginning, stone by stone, its long return. 1 year later, spring came to the Eastern Kingdom the way it always had, without asking permission, pushing up through the frost in small, insistent green things that did not care what the winter had decided about the matter. The castle grounds, which had been silent and carefully maintained under Idrin's tenure in the particular way of places where joy has been administratively removed, were not silent anymore. This was largely Brenna's doing. She had opinions about gardens. She had communicated these opinions to the castle groundskeepers on her 3rd day of residence, with the focused energy of a woman who had spent years coaxing things to grow from difficult highland soil and was not going to stand by while perfectly good earth went to waste. The groundskeepers, who had been waiting for someone to tell them what to do for the better part of a year, had received her opinions with the relief of people for whom clarity was itself a form of kindness. By midsummer there had been herbs. By autumn, something resembling order with an agreeable wildness at its edges. By the following spring, the castle grounds smelled on warm mornings of rosemary and turned earth and the particular living fullness of a place that had remembered it was supposed to be inhabited. Elizabeth walked through those grounds every morning, unhurried, with the careful pace of a woman who had decided that the luxury of an unhurried morning was not indulgence but maintenance, the tending of a self that had been through enough to deserve gentleness. The 7 ran ahead of her in the grass, dark-furred and extravagantly energetic, tumbling over each other with the cheerful violence of healthy young things. They had grown considerably in a year. The eldest, by 7 minutes, a distinction he was already leveraging with his siblings, had the particular broad-shouldered build that would, in another 2 years, make visiting dignitaries straighten unconsciously in their chairs. He also had, Elizabeth had noted with a complicated warmth, the habit of going very still when surprised, followed by a long, considering look, followed by a response that arrived at exactly the right moment. Torben's quality, Finn's quality, the bloodline's quality, hers too, she supposed. At this point, it was difficult to know where one person ended and another began, which was perhaps the point. The Great Hall had been restored in the months following the return, not ostentatiously, not in the way of a kingdom trying to prove something, but carefully, with the specific intentionality of people who understood that a space reflects the character of those who inhabit it. The long table was the same table, older now, with new marks in the wood from a year of actual use. The banners were new, the Torben crest, the crescent mark at its center, reproduced in the deep blue and silver that the kingdom had worn for 11 generations. Beneath the main banner, a smaller edition, the Highland crest of the Elder Council, acknowledging the formal alliance that had been negotiated, ratified, and celebrated over 3 days of meetings that had involved a great deal of the old law. 2 elder wolves who were deeply serious about protocol, and Brenna, who had brought the spoon and at one point used it to make a point about territorial boundaries that had been, by all accounts, both unorthodox and entirely effective. Finn sat at that table most mornings, working through the correspondence that came with being the kingdom's formal liaison to the Highland territories, a role that had expanded, in the way things expand when the person doing them is both capable and trusted, to include considerably more than correspondence. He had a gift for the work that no one had anticipated, least of all him. The Highland elders, who were not easily impressed, had described him in formal communication as possessed of uncommon steadiness and a rare ability to hear what is being said beneath what is being said. Brenna had read this citation aloud at dinner and then said, "I've been saying this for years. No one listens to me." "Everyone listens to you," Finn said without looking up. "The entire castle listens to you. The grounds staff request you specifically for decisions. The head cook asked your opinion last week on a soup recipe." "That soup needed help," Brenna said. "It was fine. It was adequate. Fine and adequate are not the same thing, and I won't have that said at this table." The elder wolf liaison, who had been visiting for 3 days and had been present for this particular category of exchange several times now, looked up from his correspondence with the expression of a man who has decided that this is simply how this household works and has made his peace with it. There was a room in the East Tower that Elizabeth had reclaimed in the first weeks of return. It had been Torben's room, not the formal chambers, not the official spaces, but the private one, the room with the window that looked east, where he had stood for years in the quiet hours looking at nothing particular and everything that mattered. She had restored it simply, the chair by the window, a small table, a single lamp. His things were there, not as a shrine, not frozen in grief, but present the way the people we have loved are present when we allow it. A book he had been reading. A ring she had worn for 40 years and set on the table every morning and put back on every evening with the deliberateness of a ritual that asks nothing of the future. She sat in that room on the evening of the anniversary. 1 year since the Highland barn, 1 year since the frost-hard road and the court slippers and the beginning of everything that had followed. And she watched the light change over the eastern landscape, and she allowed herself, simply, to feel all of it. The grief, which was real and permanent and not something to be resolved, but something to be carried with increasing ease. The joy, which was also real and permanent and larger now than it had been a year ago, expanded by 7 dark-furred presences, and 1 son found and 1 young woman who had walked into a barn with a wooden spoon and changed everything. And something else. Something she had been honest with herself about in the quiet of this room for some months now. Something that had arrived, as she had promised it would arrive, with great care and great respect and absolutely no haste. His name was Cormac. He was 67, which felt young to her, and which she told him so, and he had laughed the easy laugh of someone entirely comfortable with being teased. He was a wolf elder from the Western Territories, one of the first to respond to the Veil of Seven, one of the voices that had formally supported the reckoning. He had gray in his hair and a quality of unhurried attention that she recognized, because she had spent 40 years beside someone who had it, and she had come to understand that this quality was not common and was, in the specific vocabulary of who she was, something she could not encounter without her whole self taking note. She had not rushed toward it. She had let it come at its own pace, first as respect, then as friendship, then as the kind of friendship that becomes, very gradually and with complete honesty about what it is, something more. She had told him about Torben with the fullness it deserved, not as warning, not as apology, but as truth. And he had listened the way he listened to everything, without needing to diminish what had come before in order to make room for what might come next. "I'm not asking you to replace anything," he had said simply, one evening on the castle grounds when the question was finally present between them. "I know," she had said. "I'm not asking that either." "Then what are we asking?" She had thought about it honestly. "To be known," she said. "By someone who sees what is actually there and chooses it anyway." He had been quiet for a moment, in the way of someone making sure they had a thing right before they committed to it. "Then I choose it," he said. "I choose you, Elizabeth. Not the Luna, not the history, not the 7 heirs or the bloodline or the restored kingdom. You." "Is that enough?" She had looked at the eastern grounds and the spring evening, and the distant sound of 7 energetic wolf pups playfully exploring the herb garden Brenna had worked very hard on, and she had felt Torben in the way she always felt him. Present, warm, the permanent echo of a love that did not require her to stop living in order to honor it. "Yes," she said, "that is enough." On the evening of the anniversary, the great hall was full in the way it was meant to be full. Not a ceremony. Elizabeth had been clear about this. Not a formal occasion, not a state event, not anything that required the castle staff to press the good linens. Just the people who mattered at the long table, with good food and the particular noise of a household that has found its rhythm. Finn and Brenna on one side, close together in the easy way of people who have been through difficult things and come out the other side more certain of each other than before. Brenna was, improbably, teaching herself the old script. She had decided, with characteristic resolution, that if she was going to live in a castle with an elder council liaison, she was going to be useful about it, and she was advancing with the methodical speed of someone who approaches every new thing as a project to be completed. She was also expecting a pup of her own, which she had announced at dinner 2 months ago by setting a small pair of knitted booties on Finn's plate and waiting with transparent delight for his reaction. His reaction had been to go very still for a long moment and then look at Elizabeth down the table with an expression she would keep in the warmest part of her memory for the rest of her life. Thessaly was there, which had required a formal invitation and 3 separate reminders because Thessaly found the castle noisy and had said so without apology. She sat beside the elder woman from the Highland Council, and they were engaged in a conversation that had been running in various forms since the night of the reckoning and would probably continue for decades. They had between them a combined understanding of the old law that existed nowhere else in the known world, and the Eastern Kingdom's new council had been formally petitioned to document it, which Thessaly had agreed to on the condition that she was not required to be pleasant about the process. Cormac sat to Elizabeth's right, not at the formal position. That position was the empty chair she kept, always for Torben, which everyone at the table understood and honored without discussion. To her right, present and steady and entirely himself. The 7 pups, clean, which had required significant effort, and Brenna's spoon was raised, not for cooking this time, were arranged at the end of the table nearest the fire, in the contained chaos of 7 young things being temporarily persuaded to sit still. The eldest had flour on his ear, which Brenna claimed to know nothing about. The smallest had fallen asleep sitting up, leaning against her sibling with the perfect trust of a creature that has never had reason to doubt its welcome. Elizabeth looked at the table from one end to the other. She thought about a barn in the north and a pair of court slippers, and the cold that had long since stopped bothering her, and the 7 lives pressing warm and insistent against her ribs in the dark, and a door swinging open like a question, and a young woman's voice saying, "I have opinions about this, and I intend to share all of them." She thought about a fireplace and a crescent mark in firelight, and a man who had been looking for where he was going for 30 years and had finally arrived. She thought about letters in a cellar and a veil of 7 that had been waiting 400 years for exactly this convergence. She thought about an old law and a new morning, and the particular way the Highland sky had lit up when 7 heirs drew their first breath and announced themselves to 100 miles of waking wolves. She thought about Torben, last of all, not with the sharp grief of the first months, but with the deep, settled tenderness of someone who has integrated a great love into the ongoing structure of their life. The way old roots integrate into new soil, invisible and essential and permanent. You would have been insufferable about all of this, she told him, in the private interior where he still lived, in the best possible way. She could feel the answer, not in words but in the quality of the room around her. Warm and loud and improbably full of people she loved, every one of them present because of a chain of events that had begun the night she refused to stop being herself, even in the dark, even in slippers, even alone in a barn at the far edge of everything. Elizabeth. She came back to the table. Brenna was looking at her with that transparent face, reading her the way Brenna read everything, quickly, completely, and with absolute commitment to what she found. "Are you all right?" Brenna asked. Elizabeth looked at her, at Finn beside her, at Cormac to her right, at Thessaly being magnificently difficult at the far end, at 7 small dark shapes by the fire, alive and known and claimed. "Yes," she said, and meant it in every possible direction. "I am." The eldest pup, at that moment, made a bid for something on the table that he had clearly been planning since they sat down, and Brenna's spoon was raised with impressive speed, and everyone laughed, and the fire was warm, and outside the eastern window the spring night was wide and clear and full of ordinary stars that did not need to pulse silver to be beautiful. They were just stars. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The end. If you've listened this far, then you know what this story is really about. Not thrones or ancient laws or silver skies, though it has all of those things. It's about a woman who refused to stop being herself when the world gave her every reason to become smaller. About a son who built his own dignity from scratch and still had room to take his rightful name. About a young woman with a wooden spoon who walked into a barn and decided without hesitation that a stranger deserved warmth. If any of those things moved you, the beginning, the mark in the firelight, the moment Finn stood up in that kitchen, the Highland dawn, or this table full of people who found each other, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want more stories like this, old laws, impossible love, Luna queens who refuse to be erased, let me know that too. Until the next story, I'll be here.